During an introductory genetics lab, one student raised his hand with a deeply troubled expression. He asked whether donating blood could cause the recipient to accidentally produce a child that looked like the donor. He explained that he was worried about unintentionally spreading his DNA around town, imagining random babies showing up with his facial features. The room fell silent for a moment before several of us tried to gently clarify how genetics, reproduction, and transfusions actually work. We drew diagrams, gave examples, and even showed textbook illustrations. He remained skeptical for a surprisingly long time, repeatedly asking, "Are you completely sure?" Eventually, he accepted the explanation, though not confidently, and said he'd probably donate less often, just in case. My freshman roommate, who grew up in a very small farming community, once attempted to heat up soup in the most dangerous way possible. When I returned to our dorm, I saw him staring intently at the microwave with an unopened metal can of soup placed inside. He explained that he wanted the soup to heat from pressure, believing the sealed metal would function like a miniature pressure cooker. The microwave door was already closed, and his hand hovered over the start button. I practically dove across the room to stop him. He seemed genuinely confused as to why microwaving a metal can was an issue, insisting he'd seen something similar on TV. It took a long explanation before he reluctantly accepted defeat. In my creative writing course, we were assigned to write a short horror story. One enthusiastic student submitted a tale about being stalked by a monstrous deer that hunted humans. When the professor questioned the logic behind a herbivore suddenly turning predatory, the student defended his idea passionately. He argued that because deer consume plants that are sometimes used to create medicines for people, they were technically already eating human-related substances. Therefore, in his mind, it wasn't such a big evolutionary jump for them to develop a taste for human flesh. The professor tried to clarify how ecosystems actually work, but the student continued his argument with increasing intensity. Eventually, the professor gave up and just said, "It's fiction, I suppose." During a modern history lecture, a girl confidently announced that World War I was basically a prequel and that global leaders released a second part because the First War was so successful. She explained her reasoning as if discussing a movie franchise, saying the second conflict had higher stakes, bigger explosions, and more dramatic battles, so it made sense the world wanted a sequel. The professor stood there in stunned silence for nearly a full minute, trying to determine whether she was joking. She wasn't. She insisted the wars were designed intentionally, like entertainment media, and seemed frustrated when others tried to explain the political complexities. Eventually, the professor moved on, perhaps to preserve his sanity. On the final exam in a basic astronomy class, one essay question simply asked students to describe how the phases of the moon work. Most responses were reasonably accurate, but one student wrote a single poetic sentence: "The moon changes shape because it gets shy sometimes." That was the entire answer, no further explanation, no attempt at science, just an oddly poetic excuse for lunar behavior. When I, as the TA, showed it to the professor, he burst into laughter so intense that he had to step out of the room to compose himself. Despite the complete lack of factual accuracy, he awarded the student 1 point, not for scientific merit, but for unexpected creativity and commitment to the bit. My sweet mate received his first credit card and somehow came to the conclusion that the credit limit represented a monthly gift from the bank. He spent the entire amount within 3 days, proudly showing off a brand new gaming PC he claimed he got using bank reward money. When the bill arrived, he was outraged. He called customer service and insisted that they were scamming him, saying the credit limit was advertised as available funds, so he assumed it was free. When the representative tried to explain how credit actually works, he became indignant and claimed the company should communicate their rules in simpler words. He spent the next week complaining loudly that capitalism was too tricky for normal people. During a 3 a.m. fire drill in our dorm, one guy from our floor ran into the hallway clutching a fire extinguisher like a lifeline. Instead of evacuating, he aimed it at his laptop, which wasn't on fire or even warm. When the RA demanded to know what he was doing, He explained that fire drills were meant to prevent future fires, so he was cooling down potential hazards before anything ignited. He insisted that his laptop ran hot during gaming sessions and was therefore a likely fire source. The RA had to gently guide him outside while explaining that extinguishers aren't preventative tools. The guy nodded thoughtfully, then asked if the university had a schedule for pre-fire inspections. In the dorm kitchen, I watched a girl attempt to cook pasta in the least efficient way possible. She dumped dry spaghetti into a pot, poured cold water over the top without fully submerging it, and turned the burner on high. Then she walked away for 10 minutes. When she returned, she discovered a single sticky block of fused starch. Furious, she insisted something was wrong with the pasta itself. She complained loudly that the manufacturer must have produced a faulty batch and declared she would contact a lawyer. When other students tried to explain boiling water and cooking techniques, she refused to listen. She maintained it was defective food, and that she had been wronged as a consumer. In a public speaking class, one student gave an impassioned presentation on the dangers of dihydrogen monoxide. He described how it appears in most foods, is used in industrial chemicals, and can kill a person if inhaled. He ended dramatically by revealing that dihydrogen monoxide is just water. The class groaned, recognizing the old prank, except for the girl sitting next to me, who whispered in panic, "Wait, so is water safe or not?" She looked genuinely concerned, flipping through her notes for clarification. When the presenter reassured everyone it was harmless, she frowned and muttered, "It still sounds suspicious," as though water had suddenly become a controversial substance. A girl in my geography class was wholeheartedly convinced that Alaska was an island floating somewhere near Hawaii. She insisted the small inset map box in textbooks was the true location of the state and believed the larger map was wrong. Even when the professor brought out a physical globe and demonstrated Alaska's position next to Canada, she shook her head and claimed the globe was outdated. She said that publishers probably moved the state for convenience, and that she trusted the rectangular textbook inset more than real geography. After a while, the professor gave up, and she proudly told her friends she had won the argument with facts. In my philosophy class, we discussed the classic thought experiment. If a tree falls in the forest with no one around, does it make a sound? One student immediately interrupted, insisting the answer was obviously yes because squirrels live there and would hear it. The professor gently explained that, in the context of the thought experiment, no one refers to the absence of observers entirely, including animals. The student looked offended and argued that we couldn't assume squirrels exist in our same reality framework. He claimed animals might operate on a different plane of existence and therefore shouldn't count. The professor tried a few times to redirect the discussion, but the student held firm, proudly stating he was thinking outside the matrix. In chemistry lab, my partner seriously asked whether we could pour all our leftover chemicals into a single beaker at the end of class to create a new element. She said it the same way someone might ask about mixing paint colors to get a new shade. When I explained that combining random substances would likely release toxic fumes or possibly trigger a dangerous reaction, she was visibly disappointed. She said she thought discovering a new element sounded fun and hands-on. I tried again to describe how elements can't be created by simply stirring things together. She sighed dramatically and said the periodic table was too limited for creative experimentation. While studying in the campus library, I overheard a student angrily explaining to a friend on the phone that she had failed her geography exam. Her friend asked what happened. The girl responded that the professor had asked her to name a European country, and she confidently wrote down Paris. She couldn't understand why she lost points because, in her words, Paris was like the most iconic European place. She suggested the professor had some personal bias against France. When someone nearby tried to gently explain the difference between a country and a city, she waved dismissively and said, "Whatever. It's basically a country. Everyone knows Paris better anyway." A football player in my literature class wrote an essay claiming that Captain Ahab was actually the rightful hero of Moby Dick because the whale was a marine criminal. He argued that Moby Dick had repeatedly violated ocean territory laws by trespassing where it didn't belong. In his version, Ahab wasn't obsessed or self-destructive, he was simply fulfilling his duty as an officer of maritime justice. He even described the whale as a terroristic threat to sailors everywhere. The professor tried to explain themes like obsession, symbolism, and tragedy, but the student doubled down, insisting his reading was more grounded than the traditional interpretation. He turned the essay in proudly, confident he had uncovered the real story. My roommate did laundry for the first time in his life and assumed any soap would work, so he dumped an entire bottle of blue dishwashing liquid into the washing machine. Within minutes, suds began erupting from all sides of the washer like a frothy volcano. The foam spread across the laundry room floor, creeping under the doors and startling everyone who walked by. Instead of panicking, my roommate just stood there with his arms crossed, nodding at the expanding soap ocean. At least, he shrugged, my clothes are gonna be insanely clean. It took campus maintenance an hour to clear everything out, and the RA banned him from using dish soap ever again. During a political science lecture on the 3 branches of government, a student raised his hand and asked which branch the FBI belonged to. The professor answered, the executive branch. The student nodded thoughtfully, then followed up with a very serious question. Okay, so which branch do the men in black come from? Are they like the secret 4th one? The class burst out laughing, but the student remained confused. He clarified that he had always assumed the government kept mysterious agents with sunglasses, separate from the normal system. The professor tried to explain that the men in black were fictional, but the student left the conversation looking unconvinced, as though he believed the professor was hiding classified information. At the IT help desk, a student came in complaining that her laptop's cup holder had snapped. We were confused until she pointed to the broken CD/DVD tray, which she had been using to hold her coffee mug during late-night study sessions. She seemed genuinely frustrated that it couldn't support the weight of her drink. She asked whether the warranty covered the damage, saying she had barely leaned on it. When we explained that it wasn't a cup holder at all, she looked shocked and said laptops should really label things better. She left muttering that modern technology was poorly designed for multitasking students. In a nutrition class, the professor was explaining the basics of vegetarian diets. A student raised her hand and said she could never become a vegetarian. The professor asked why, and she answered, completely seriously, because I love chicken, and chickens aren't animals, they're birds. The entire room froze. The professor blinked a few times before replying gently, birds are a type of animal. The girl frowned, clearly thinking it over, and then shrugged as if unconvinced. She continued taking notes as though she had delivered a valid scientific insight. My roommate had a bizarre belief that turning off all the electronics in our room would save the internet for later, like storing battery life. He routinely went around unplugging everything, including the router, insisting this would make the Wi-Fi extra strong when he needed to play online games. Whenever the internet stopped working, because he had unplugged the router, he blamed me for using up all the data waves. I tried explaining how networks function, but he shook his head and said, "You don't understand digital conservation." He was completely serious. In my statistics class, a student argued passionately that if there was a 50% chance of rain on Saturday and a 50% chance on Sunday, then rain was guaranteed for the weekend. He said the numbers obviously add up to 100%. The professor patiently explained how probability works and why independent events don't simply combine like addition problems. The student refused to accept this, saying the explanation was just the professor's personal interpretation. He crossed his arms and insisted his math was common sense. Several students tried to help, but he remained steadfast. The professor eventually moved on, shaking his head.